we've been joking all day that the last time Dr. Licona was here was the Notre Dame game, which we all know how that turned out. It was for the best. We have a theory that he brings the rain. We'll have to bring him one more time to find out if that theory is true. I'm Nathan Beasley. I'm the acting president for Ratio Christi. If you don't know, Ratio Christi is a club with a funny name. That name means Reasons for Christ. We're really interested in studying what reasons there could be to believe that Christianity is true, that Jesus Christ, and what that means specifically is whether Christ really did live, teach, die, and rise again. Now, I don't suspect that we're all Christians here, so let me at least make this deal with you. Let's all start where we can agree on certain ideas about philosophy, history, some basic understanding of science. Let's try and see what we can know about different belief systems. And let's try and grade them on which one we think is the most coherent. Let's try and think about which one of them a reasonable person could get behind. I think as we do that, we can in some way come together, despite where we might be as different people, and really do an honest investigation. So toward that end, we have Dr. Licona here tonight. He's going to talk to you in just a few minutes about the Bible's reliability. I want to invite you, we meet on a weekly basis. So we'll talk about all kinds of topics concerning history of the universe, cosmology, specifically the biblical record, the different historians writing in and around the time of Jesus, and all kinds of different philosophical considerations about what it means that the universe might have had a beginning, what it means that we have this moral intuition about ourselves, about the way we ought to act. So I welcome you to come out, whatever your persuasion is. We have people of all different belief systems that come and study together. I think it's a real testimony to the kind of discussion we have that we do have regularly, atheists, Christians from different denominations, and we're able to have cordial conversations. The kind of thing that you won't see on Facebook is probably a good way to say it. Yeah, everything that Facebook isn't. So I hope you'll join us Mondays at 7:15 and Hard at 2:33. Talk to me more afterward if you'd like to learn about those. Also, you can talk to Caroline in the back. She'll get you on our listserv if you want to learn more. All right, without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Robert, our Vice President, who will introduce our speaker for the evening. Good evening. One more thing. We will have an extensive Q&A session at the end. We just ask that you leave all soapboxes at the door. We want our concise questions and to the point. Please do your best to phrase it as a question and not as a statement. We ask these things generally in our discussions as well so that we can all get questions and get as many of them in as possible in a short amount of time. We will have about 45 minutes to an hour, depending how long the lecture goes. So I encourage you to take notes. Really think about what he's saying, challenge him, but let's do it respectfully. That's all I ask. Great.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Robert Underwood, and as Nathan mentioned, I'm the Vice President of Ratio Christi for this chapter this year. I have the honor of introducing Dr. Michael Licona. He has a PhD in New Testament Studies from the University of Pretoria, which he completed with distinction. He serves as Associate Professor in Theology at Houston Baptist University. He is an author of numerous books, including Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? What Can I Learn from Ancient Biography? The Resurrection of Jesus, A New Historiographical Approach, Paul Meets Mohammed, co-authored with Gary Habermas of the award-winning book, Case of the Resurrection of Jesus, co-edited with William Debrutsky for Evidence of God, 50 Arguments for Faith from the Bible, History, Philosophy, and Science. He is a member of the Evangelical, Theological, and Philosophical Societies, the Institute for Biblical Research, and the Society for Biblical Literature. He has spoken at over 90 universities, including this one in the past, and has appeared on various radio and television programs. With that said, let's welcome Dr. Michael Licona.
Oh. Well, thanks. Good to be here at Clemson. And my son and I, we were really pulling for the Tigers during the championship game. And we're from Atlanta, and so we're Falcons fans as well. And so we were, of course, pulling for the Falcons in the Super Bowl, and that was disappointing to us. But both of us would agree, we've talked about it, and if we had to choose between the Tigers winning or the Falcons winning, we would have chosen the Tigers. Because I'm on faculty at Houston Baptist University, I'm primarily a Huskies fan, okay? But you can understand that. But after the Huskies, it's go Tigers. Okay? So it's great to be back here on campus. So let me give you just a little idea of what got me into this particular topic in which I've been asked to speak tonight, the historical reliability of the Gospels. Back in 2008, I had been asked to debate Bart Ehrman, who I heard was on campus about a month or so ago. And Ehrman and I are friends. We've become friends. We've now debated 5 times. And we've had dinner before some of our debates, and I see him about once a year. We hug each other. So we are friends. We're on a friendly basis. But our first couple of debates were on the resurrection of Jesus. Did Jesus rise from the dead? And probably half of his argument was to criticize the Gospels and argue that they are historically unreliable literature about Jesus. And if you've ever heard me debate or lecture on the resurrection, even though I believe the Gospels are historically reliable, I don't use them because I don't need to. We can show that Jesus rose from the dead just from Paul, who scholars agree is a pretty good source and is earlier than the Gospels and is supposed to have been an eyewitness. So for me, he could go, I could have granted everything that he said about the Gospels, and it still wouldn't have made any difference when it came to the resurrection of Jesus. And there were a number of Christians who watched the debate and said, and even some non-Christians said, well, Ehrman lost the debates on the resurrection. But nevertheless, he still put a lot of doubts and troubled a lot of Christians when it came to, can I trust the Gospels? And so I started to study the issue. I started to study, first of all, on gospel contradictions. And that resulted, I did 8 years of study on that. That resulted in a book that came out last year, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? And also during that time, I was studying various issues regarding to historical reliability. And so last spring, Ehrman and I were asked to do a written debate on the question, are the Gospels historically reliable accounts of the life of Jesus? So we did. If any of you are interested in reading that debate, because for all you know, I might just be making some of the stuff up tonight, or you might say, well, that sounds good, but how would someone like Bart Ehrman or a skeptical scholar respond to it? Well, you can read it for yourselves. So it's coming out in a book later this year, but you can read the whole debate for free right now without having to buy a book by going to my website, risenjesus.com, and then also add /Gospels in the plural, Gospels. risenjesus.com /Gospels, and that will take you where you can watch or read that written debate on this topic, and you can decide for yourself. Well, I've taken some of the material from them and fine-tuned it a little bit, and so I'm going to just present in a condensed version tonight on a case for the historical reliability of the Gospels. So I'll probably talk to about just shy of an hour, maybe an hour from now, and open it up for Q&A, okay? So the first question we want to ask when we talk about historical reliability is we have to define what is it we actually mean by historically reliable. Because the whole thing can hinge on how we define this term. Now, when I started to prepare for that written debate with Ehrman on this topic, I was thinking, well, this is an interesting question. How would we actually define historically reliable? And I sent out an email to 3 prominent historians situated around the globe. And 2 of them came back with different answers, they did, from one another. And the third, who teachers at a major British school said, "What an interesting question." So let's ask, what does it we mean by the term historically reliable? Does it mean inspired, or inerrant, or authoritative, or infallible? Well, no, it doesn't mean any of these things. It's a different question. So for example, for those of you who are Christians in here, when we talk about Psalms in the Bible, or Proverbs, or the book of Revelation, or Ecclesiastes, if I were to ask you, is that literature that I just mentioned, is it historically reliable? How would you answer that? Are the Psalms historically reliable? Not a quick trick question, but of course you'd be thinking to yourself, well, you can't really ask that question when it comes to Psalms, which are it's poetry, right? Or Proverbs, or Revelation, apocalyptic literature, things like that. You wouldn't ask if it's historically reliable because it doesn't make sense. It's not germane. It'd be like saying, does the color blue meet EPA regulations? You wouldn't ask that question. And it's the same thing with certain literature. It wouldn't apply to that. But yet, we would believe that the Psalms and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Revelation is divinely inspired, right? We could say any of these things, or those previous things, inerrant, infallible, authoritative. We could say that regarding that literature, but we wouldn't say it's historically reliable. Now what about Tacitus's Annals of Rome? Tacitus wrote in the beginning of the 2nd century, and his writings are regarded as historically reliable accounts of things that happened within the Roman Empire. Same could be said about Suetonius and Sallust and others. But the writings of Tacitus are not divinely inspired. They're not inerrant. They have errors in it. They're written by a guy who had his own biases. So it doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be perfectly accurate. He takes some flexibilities, like there was one time at the trial of Piso, and it happened, I think it was in December, and he moves it back to the spring of that year in order to move the story along quicker to improve the drama and to keep people involved in the story. So, and this was a common technique of ancient historians and biographers. So he's not perfect, he's not exactly historically accurate on a lot of things in a precise way, but yet historians of antiquity would say Tacitus is certainly historically reliable. In fact, he's one of our most accurate sources of the period. So my point is, you can have something that's divinely inspired but not historically reliable. You can have something that's historically reliable but not divinely inspired. Or you can have something in theory like the Gospels, the book of Acts, that are both. What I want to point out is tonight, the question I am addressing are the Gospels historically reliable? I'm not asking, are they divinely inspired? That's a different question. I'm not asking, are they inerrant? Are they infallible? Are they authoritative? Those are all different questions. They're important questions, but it's not the question I'm answering or addressing this evening, okay? So how do we define historically reliable? Well, however we're going to define it, it's got to apply to all ancient literature. So it would be wrong, first of all, to start with the Gospels and say, let's be biased Christians, and let's start with the Gospels and say, well, this is what the Gospels are, and they meet these criteria, so this is what historically reliable means, and then we'll apply it to other ancient literature. If we're going to do this with integrity, with honesty, it has to apply to all literature across the board. In fact, you could start with the other ancient literature, like Suetonius and Tacitus and these others, and see what is it in that literature that would lead someone to say they're historically reliable, and then apply it to the Gospels and see if they meet the test. You have to take into consideration genre or literary style. Like I said, we would not apply the term historical reliability to the Psalms or Proverbs. The Gospels are considered by the majority of New Testament scholars to be ancient biography. And ancient biography operated by some rules that differed a little bit from modern biography. And so we have to judge ancient historical literature by the rules of their day rather than imparting our ideas of modern precision upon them. And we would want future historians to do the same for us. I mean, suppose it gets to a point in the future, 500 years from now, if we're all still around, not us, but the humans are still around in 500 years, and there's so much knowledge going on, so much we're learning, that they say, well, if you're going to write good history, you got to do a biography in one page. Or you have to do it in such a way and focusing on certain events where you illuminate the character of the person and you conflate certain events together to illuminate that, so you have a minimal number of events that are reported, but it actually contains stuff that happened in a bunch of different events. And those historians from the 21st century, they had to do all these separate. That's bad history. It takes better and more skill to do it this way in the 26th century. Well, that would be wrong to say that we're bad historians today because we operated by different rules. You got to judge them by the rules of their day. And so we have to understand what those rules are. Let me just give you an example of some of the flexibility that ancient historians would take. So how many of you saw the movie Apollo 13? Okay, all right, most of you. Well, I remember, I'm 55, and I remember back in 1970, I guess I was in April of 1970, I would have been 8, almost 9 years old at the time. And I remember it happening. I was really into NASA and the moon shots and all of that. And I remember my mom coming into my bedroom and saying, Mike, we got to pray for the astronauts. They're in trouble. And we prayed for them. And later on, when you watch the movie Apollo 13, which Ron Howard was praised for his accuracy involved in producing this movie, they say the astronauts only had a 10% chance of making it back alive. So it was a real dangerous mission. Well, Gene Kranz, the flight director who was portrayed by Ed Harris in the movie Apollo 13, is famous for, he wrote a book on this, Failure is Not an Option, and that was a tagline in the movie Apollo 13, right? When they're trying to figure out, he said to his team, failure is not an option. Well, it may surprise you to learn that Gene Kranz never uttered that statement. What happened is, this movie takes place, and it takes 9 events that happened over a 9-month period and narrates them happening over 2 hours. So you take some artistic license in order to get truth out. You may play with the details a little bit. You're communicating truth, though. You're not allowed to play with the details to communicate something that did not happen. That would be to go too far. All right? They didn't do that with Apollo 13, but what they did was, by interviewing Gene Kranz and his team, they said, how could we take and epitomize, we want to epitomize this attitude and approach that they took to solving the problem. And we want to do it in an accurate way, but we want to do it in a clear way. How do we do that? And so the script writers came up with the statement, failure is not an option, and they put it on Gene Kranz's lips. So was that an accurate portrayal of what happened? Yes, but not in a precise sense. You could say it gives you an accurate gist of what occurred, more than a gist. It gives you a true representation, even if not in every detail. It's essentially true. Well, the one I like best comes from Christopher Pelling, the leading Plutarch scholar in the world. He retired from Oxford about 2 years ago, and he says it's true enough. And I think that makes sense. And you know, to us guys in here, how many of you are married? Guys? Okay, lots of you? You know what I'm talking about. Because there's a guy version of the story and a girl version of the story. The girls like lots of details. Now, of course, I'm generalizing here, right? But girls like lots of details. They want to know what happened, when it happened, how it happened, who was there, what they said, what they were wearing, how they felt. And now what do you think and how you feel about it now that you know what happened? Guys, we just like bullet points. Get to the bottom line. The game's coming on in 5 minutes. Right? And so sometimes when we're talking and relaying a story, we will abbreviate it and we will alter details in such a way not to corrupt the story or to mislead a person, but we do it because we want to encapsulate the story and do it in an economical way, an economy of words. And we want to give them truth, but it doesn't necessarily have to be in a precise sense. So guys, you just tell your wives from now on when she says, you know it didn't happen that way, you just say, honey, it's true enough. That's what we're looking at when we come to ancient history. That's what they were concerned to do. They weren't concerned to record things necessarily in a precise sense like we are today. They wanted it to be true enough. True enough. All right, so we keep that in mind. Oh, by the way, there's one historian who wrote around the days of Jesus. He wrote about 3 to 4 decades after Jesus. His name was Asconius. And he wrote, most like historians like to write today. He gives us the girl version. He wants all the details, exactly how they happened. But you know what? His writings haven't survived. And the reason being, I mean, we've got some, but the reason being he did not become a popular historian is because he wasn't writing that kind of history that they wanted back then. They wanted the true enough, but they wanted that portrait of the person to be painted. Accurate, and they wanted it to illuminate who that person was or what happened in those events, but it did not have to be precise. So this is how we have to judge literature for historical reliability. It needs to be true enough. So I want to give you what we could call the 3 C's for historical reliability of the Gospels, the 3 C's. This message brought to you by the letter C. The first C is the criteria. The question is, when may an account be regarded as historically reliable? What are the criteria? And I want to propose 5 criteria. First, historical intent. Do we have good reasons to think that the author intended to write accurate history? Second, and we're going to look at each of these in more detail. Second, good judgment. Do we have good reason to think that the author used good judgment in their choice and use of sources? Third, do we have good reason to think that the author or their sources were capable of reporting accurate history? 4, can we verify numerous reports in that literature to have been true? And 5th, can we show that no more than a small percentage of what's being reported is false? Or in other words, of everything that we can verify, do we have reason to think that any more than just a small percentage is false? Remember, we're looking at historical reliability here, not inerrancy, not divinely inspired, just historical reliability. Let's go to the second C, which is conformity. We want to assess the Gospels in view of these criteria to see how they match up with them. So the first criterion, do we have reason to think that the author intended to write an accurate account? Now, let's look at when it comes to the Gospels with this. First of all, we see that the Gospels are writing according to a biographical genre. All right, it's not a unique genre that they're writing. They're writing according to ancient biography, and this shouldn't surprise us. Even all the biblical literature, whether it's the historical books of the Old Testament, Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, wisdom literature, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, the prophetic books, you come to the New Testament, Acts, which is history, first 3 decades of the church. You've got the letters, the epistles. You've got Hebrews, which is a homily, a sermon. You have Revelation, which is apocalyptic literature that we also find in 1st Enoch and 4th Ezra in the Jewish literature. So if the biblical authors are using contemporary genres to write, then we should be surprised that the gospel authors weren't either, if they weren't using a contemporary genre. And of course, if you're writing a biography of Jesus, then you're going to use biographical genre, right? So most scholars think that the Gospels are ancient biography. And there's plenty of reasons why. Let me just give you a few of those reasons. In ancient biography, the emphasis is on a main character, whereas in history, the emphasis is on an era or an event like a war or a government. In ancient biography, there is usually mention of the person's ancestry, their family line, and then it just skips to launch into their public service, such as government, military, or teaching. So maybe sometimes you thought, well, why don't the Gospels ever talk about Jesus' childhood? There's only one mention in the Gospel of Luke about Jesus at 12 years old. Other than that, it goes from his birth to all of a sudden his baptism when he's in his 30s. Why is that? Because they're ancient biographies. It talks about his family lineage, the genealogies, or in the case of Mark, it's the fulfillment of prophecy. In the case of John, it's God, the Son of God who's come to be with us. You talk about his ancestry, and then boom, you launch right into his public service, his ministry. That's what we have with the Gospels, and that is why Jesus' childhood is not mentioned in them. In ancient biography, the main subject's character is illuminated through the person's words and deeds. Fourth, we could get in. Let me just give you a little interesting thing here. How many of you have heard someone say, well, you have this evolving Christology. So, in other words, the view of Jesus in the Gospels evolves over time. So in the earliest Gospel, Mark, you have Jesus, he's the Messiah, he's a great man, a great teacher. But then he becomes the Messiah in Matthew, and then the Son of God in Luke, and then when you get to John's Gospel, he becomes God at that point. You ever hear that? Okay, well, that's because they're not reading it with the lenses of ancient biography. Watch what happens when you read Mark, understanding this, that it's trying to illuminate the quality, the character of the main subject. And by the way, Plutarch, in his biography of Alexander the Great, chapter 1, he says, look, you'll have to excuse me if I don't mention the main characters, all their great deeds. He says, sometimes you can capture a person's personality and who they are more in a smile than you can when they defeat thousands on the battlefield. He said, I'm writing biography, not history. And so he says, everything that he is doing is going to be to illuminate who his main character is, what kind of person, who they are. Now with that in mind, think of how the Gospel of Mark opens. Chapter 1, very beginning. It says, as Isaiah the prophet said, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight the paths of our God. And then it introduces Jesus, but it's not Jesus preparing the way for God. It's John the Baptist preparing the way for Jesus. What is that saying in the very beginning about who Mark thinks Jesus is? It's God. Mark chapter 2. You have Jesus heals a paralytic and forgives him his sins. And the Jewish leaders around say, well, that's blasphemy. Only God can forgive sins. Yep. Chapter 3, Jesus is awakened out of his sleep. He calms the wind and the waves. Well, the Old Testament says only God does that. Chapter 4, they say that Jesus is casting out demons by Satan. And Jesus says, well, wait a minute. Satan doesn't cast out Satan. And then he says, when a guy comes and he wants to rob a strong man's house, he has to first bind the strong man, and then he can plunder his goods. He's plundering the kingdom of the strong man, Satan. And now the exorcisms, he's coming in and he's plundering his kingdom. Well, what human binds Satan? And on and on and on. You got Jesus walking on water in John chapter 6. The Old Testament says only God walks on water. Jesus raises someone from the dead. All right. Well, the Old Testament says only God raises someone. Well, wait a minute. You got others like Peter and Paul raise people from the dead. Some of the Old Testament prophets raised people from the dead. Yes, but they did so by praying and asking for God to do it. Jesus didn't do that. He did it with his own word. And what happens in Mark chapter 9 at the Transfiguration? After that, he comes down off the mountain, and a guy had come to his disciples and said, please help my son, he's demon-possessed. And they've tried to cast the demon out, and they can't. And Jesus says the word and casts the demon out. Later on, his disciples say, well, why weren't we able to do that? And Jesus says, because this kind only comes out by prayer to God. Hey, Peter, did you see Jesus? He didn't pray. You see how chapter after chapter after chapter in Mark, the earliest gospel to be written, the whole thing is painting a portrait of who Jesus is. He's God. You see this when you read it through the lenses of ancient biography. Ancient biographies, their length, 10 to 20,000 words. Why? They didn't have TV, they didn't have Netflix, they didn't have DVRs, videos, DVDs, all that kind of stuff. They didn't have that. So they learned through people coming in and telling stories, oral tradition that had been passed along to them for a long time. So this was a means of education and entertainment. So an ancient biography would be written of such a length that it could be read in a single sitting after dinner. So this 10 to 20,000 words was the usual length. And you can see that the Gospels fall right within that category, don't they? And those words the number up there is the number of Greek words. And Greek is the original language of the New Testament literature. Now, some skeptics would say that, and there's not many of them, but some would say, well, the Gospels are actually ancient novels. They're not biographies, they're novels. Let me just say a few things about that. Ancient novels were almost always romances in which two lovers had to overcome obstacles. That's not the Gospels. Ancient novels sometimes, on occasion, they could include characters who were historical. In other words, the people, a character within an ancient novel had actually lived sometime in the past. But there's not, number one, it's rare, and number two, there is not a single example of an ancient novel in which the historical character in it had lived within a century of the author. It's not what we have with the Gospels. You've got Caesar Augustus, you have Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate, you've got various Herods involved, you have Jesus, you have John the Baptist. These are all characters that we know existed. They're historical figures. The places are real that are mentioned in there. So they do not bear the marks of ancient novels. Let me just give you one example, a modern example. I don't know if you saw the movie The Patriot with Mel Gibson. Okay, that is fiction. It never happened. But there are historical characters in there like General Cornwallis. And because he's in it, but he didn't, the story came out just after the year 2000. You know, almost 200 years after the character Cornwallis had lived. So, again, this is like what ancient novels are. They don't have current, contemporary historical characters in them. So, did the author intend to write an accurate account? First of all, biographical genre. That doesn't tell us everything because some biographies have a whole lot more fiction in them than others, but it does tell us at least there's some intent involved to write history. Is there a stated historical intent? Do they actually state that they're wanting to report accurate history? Well, look at the Gospel of Luke, chapter 1. He writes, "It seemed fitting for me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know for certain the things you have been taught." That's pretty clear there that Luke is saying he's intending to write accurate history. Or what about the Gospel of John? "And the one who has seen has testified. His testimony is true, and he knows he is telling the truth, so that you may also believe." Is John clear? I mean, could he be more clear that he's intending to report accurate history? Now, maybe you could say he's lying. It doesn't mean he's reporting accurate history, but the intent, he's saying he is intending to write accurate history is pretty clear. Now, sometimes the intent isn't so much directly stated, but we can see some things that would suggest that they are intending to write accurate history. So, let's look at the Gospel of Mark for a moment. There's a text in it when Jesus is going to be crucified, and he stumbles under the weight of his cross after scourging, and it says, "The soldiers forced a passerby to carry his cross, Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus, who was coming in from the country. Now, many scholars have noted that the mention here of Alexander and Rufus is kind of interesting. Why would Mark mention Alexander and Rufus? And a number of them have said it's because Mark's readers would have known Alexander and Rufus, and that's their tie. It would tie them in and say, oh yeah, Simon, that Simon's the one that did it. And by the way, as Craig Evans and one of my colleagues at HBU, very prominent, one of the most prominent New Testament scholars in the world, he contributed an essay in a book edited by James Charlesworth at Princeton, Jesus and Archaeology. And in there, Evans writes, and he says, we may very well have found the ossuary, the bone box of, I think it was Alexander. It was either Alexander or Rufus, one of them. I think it was Alexander, the bone box in which his bones had been buried, the son of Simon of Cyrene. Pretty cool. Then we got to ask, are there any contemporary competing accounts? Now, are there different accounts of this person and they contradict what is being said? So when we come to Jesus, our earliest accounts of Jesus are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all written in the 1st century. And then you come to the 2nd century, the Egerton II papyri, you have the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Mary. And then you come to the 3rd century, you get the Gospel of Philip, and then there's the secret Gospel of Mark, which is a forgery written in 1958 by Morton Smith. What's interesting to note here is that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John present a similar portrait of Jesus. It's not until you get to the 2nd century that you get these competing portraits, but none of them are as early as the Gospels. They're written all after the Gospels. And it's interesting, even Bart Ehrman, the agnostic New Testament scholar at UNC Chapel Hill, he says in his New Testament intro that these other Gospels that we're looking at here, that these represent more of what some Christians were saying about Jesus in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. He said, but if you want to know who the real Jesus was, there's only one place to go. And he says that's the New Testament Gospels. And he adds, he says, this is not for theological reasons. It's for historical reasons, pure and simple, he said. That's a virtual quote. This is Ehrman, an agnostic scholar, saying this. So this just isn't me, Mike Licona, Christian, saying it. There are reasons, if we look at the Gospels that we have in the New Testament as the earliest. Let's go to the second criterion, and that is we have good reasons to believe that the author used good judgment in their choice and use of sources. What reasons might we have to think that the Gospels used good judgment in their choice of sources? Well, first of all of the ancient testimony is that Mark used the Apostle Peter as his primary source. Peter would have been the lead apostle. I don't have time to get into all the evidence for this, but I can tell you this, the majority of scholars today say that the evidence suggests this is true. That Mark was the author of the Gospel of Mark, and that his primary source was the Apostle Peter. And if that's true, it doesn't get much better than that for your primary source on Jesus. The majority of scholars also acknowledge that the Gospel of Luke, the primary source was Mark, and then there's a hypothetical source named Q. They say, well, what is Q? Well, you have Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and Mark is regarded as the earliest gospel, and there's a lot of material in Mark, well, about 220 verses that also appear almost word for word in Matthew and Luke. So scholars conclude that it's the most probable explanation for that is that Matthew and Luke used Mark as their primary source, and they supplemented it with others. And you could do that. That was common in antiquity to do something like that. Well, I said about 220 verses. That's wrong. Okay, there's a lot of verses that in Mark, about 90% of Mark is used by Matthew and Luke. Okay, but there are about 220 verses that do not appear in Mark, but appear in Matthew and Luke. They're similar verses. So they're not using Mark because the material is not in Mark. So there's only one of three possibilities can happen here. Either Matthew is using Luke, or Luke is using Matthew, or both of them are using a common source. And the majority think, they're persuaded today that they're using a common source. That was earlier. We don't know what that was. It could have been some notes that one of the disciples took down of Jesus' teachings and carried around with them, and they used that as a source. We don't know what it was. It only mentions Jesus' sayings, whatever, there's 200 verses, 220 verses. It's only Jesus' sayings, so that's why it could be notes that the disciples took. We don't know what it was. We don't know if it was an oral source or a written source. Most scholars think it was a written source because this material appears in the same kind of order on most occasions throughout Matthew and Luke. Well, why Q? Well, because the German word for source, they don't say X or Y or Z or something. The German word for source is Quelle. So Q is just an abbreviation for the German word. And it just means source. So it's a hypothetical source upon which Matthew and Luke would have drawn that we no longer have. So it's either that or Luke used Matthew, would be that material. And then Paul, they agree, that Luke was a traveling companion of Paul. Paul would have been an eyewitness who also knew the other apostles. And as Luke says in the beginning of his gospel, he got it from eyewitnesses. So these are all pretty good sources that Luke would have been showing good judgment. I want someone who knew and used the alleged eyewitnesses. Those are good sources. Gospel of John. Church tradition says that the Gospel of John was written by one of Jesus' 12 disciples, John the son of Zebedee. I think that church tradition is correct here. But I freely admit that the majority of scholars goes against that. But the majority of scholars do think that whoever wrote the Gospel of John, it may have been either another one of Jesus' disciples, not one of the 12, but a minor disciple who had traveled with him, or whoever wrote it got all or most of their information from one of Jesus' disciples. Either way, that's pretty good. That's showing good judgment in your choice of sources. Matthew is the most difficult one, and let me explain why. Our earliest source that says Matthew wrote the Gospel of Matthew says that Matthew wrote it originally in Aramaic. But experts not only do we not have any manuscripts of Matthew in Aramaic, but experts in the Greek language, and I'm talking about people who really know this stuff. I mean, I've studied Greek since December of 1982. I read the New Testament in Greek, but I'm not an expert in it. I mean, I'm talking about people who write grammars and really know the language. And even evangelical Christian New Testament scholars will say, who are specialists in the Greek, will say, Matthew doesn't appear to have been written in Aramaic. The Greek that we have in Matthew today is not translation Greek. The Matthew we have today was originally written in Greek. So what does that say about Papias' testimony? So scholars come up with a number of explanations for that. And we don't know. We just can't get back. We can't get into a time machine, go back and see which one really happened. A friend of mine, Dan Wallace, he thinks that maybe Papias was talking about, because he doesn't mention that it was a gospel. He calls it the teachings of the Lord, the teachings of Jesus. So if that's the case, it could certainly be some of Jesus' discourses, like the Sermon on the Mount, the Olivet Discourse right before he was killed, a few like that. Maybe they were originally written in Aramaic, and then those got translated into Greek. And then under Matthew's supervision, the person that he hired took some material from Mark, combined some material from Matthew that he translated, and some other material that Matthew volunteered and gave to him, and that's the Gospel of Matthew that we have today. We just don't know. What we can know is that Matthew's sources were Mark, Q. If there wasn't a Q, then he got it from Luke, or another source, and then at least one other source. And we wouldn't know much about that source, but here's the thing. The early church tradition is unanimous that Matthew was involved in the penning of this gospel. He attributes it to him. And you just can't dismiss that. And so I think that Matthew, my view is that Matthew was involved in the writing of this gospel. We just don't know to what extent. Could have supervised the whole writing, we just don't know. But we can, our goal here isn't to establish traditional authorship. It's, are they using good judgment in their choice of sources for historical reliability? And the answer to that is certainly yes. 3, did they use the sources responsibly? I'm sorry, this is still part of the second. Here we can compare how Plutarch used his sources and how Josephus used his sources. And listen, I've spent 8 years studying Plutarch. I can tell you, Plutarch does a pretty good, we know sometimes he's using Asinius Pollio, a lot of times he's using Pollio, other times he uses Dionysius of Halicarnassus, and we can compare it with like what Dionysius wrote or what Pollio wrote as preserved by others. And we can see that they stick to their sources pretty well. But you know, when we study how Matthew and Luke use Mark, we see that Matthew and Luke stay closer to Mark than either Plutarch or Josephus stayed with their sources. That was pretty interesting. One thing that I was struck with after my 8 years of looking at Plutarch and the Gospels for why we have differences in them, it's not so much the differences that really, after you look at how the same authors, ancient biographers and historians use their sources, it's not the differences that really stick out to you with the Gospels. It's the similarities, because they don't play around with their stuff. They will change things a little bit, like Matthew will change how Mark says things for different reasons, paraphrasing and all that. But Plutarch and Josephus, they sometimes they play fast and loose with theirs. I mean, Josephus the Jewish historian will say, hey, I'm going to use the scriptures here, and I'm not going to add, I'm not going to subtract, I'm not going to alter anything. And then when you read how he uses scriptures, he proceeds to add, subtract, and alter. At least how we would think of add, subtract, and alter. But with the Gospels, even though sometimes they copy and paste, and a lot of times they don't, they stay closer to their sources where we can verify than any other ancient historian. That's pretty cool. And you got to ask, why would they do that? Well, probably because they revered their sources, because this was an important message to them. All right, third criterion. This is the most fun one. The author of their sources were capable. Are they capable of recalling sources accurately? And here we look at large-scale conjecturing. A conjecture would be conjecturing would be something that a historian would do when there's insufficient data. So they're conjecturing, they're filling in the blanks of what they think it must have been like. So it's kind of like Sallust when he's talking about the war with Catiline. When Catiline, the senator, had rebelled and got this rebellion and was going to come on Rome, and he formed this band of rebels. Well, the Roman armies went out to meet them. Well, Sallust reports that there weren't any survivors. But Sallust reports a speech that Catiline gave to his troops right before they went into that final battle. Well, and encouraging them, saying, you got to fight. You know, this is for freedom and yada, yada. Well, here's the thing. How would Sallust have known what Catiline had said when there were no survivors? You have a conjecture. He conjectured of what that speech would have probably been like. Well, when you are looking at people, Plutarch, when he wrote about figures that were relatively close to his own time, within, say, 140 years, like Cicero, Caesar, Brutus, Antony, Crassus, Sertorius, Lucullus, people like this, well, he doesn't have to conjecture. He says he's got some really good sources. All right? But when he's writing about figures in the distant past, like Theseus, the legendary founder of Athens, or Greece, and Romulus, the legendary founder of Rome, 800 to 1,000 years later, then he's got to engage in large-scale conjecture. In fact, here's what he says in the beginning of his life of Theseus. He says, Now that I have traversed those periods of time which are accessible to probable reasoning, having just written about Caesar and Cicero and those folks within 140 years, now that I've dealt with those, where I have history dealing with facts, I might well say of the earlier periods of which I'm about to write, Croesus and Romulus, what lies beyond is full of marvels and unreality, a land of poets and fabulists, of doubt and obscurity. May I therefore succeed in purifying fable, making her submit to reason and take on the semblance of history. What Plutarch is saying is when I have figures on which I'm writing that are within close to my own lifetime, I've got a lot of historical records, stuff that's based on eyewitness testimony, because you can go back to their grandkids and who were actually there, that's been passed down from that. I can report about good stuff. But when I go back, and now that I'm going to talk about Theseus and Romulus, I'm going to do my best to make it sound like history, but I don't have any good sources. All I have to work with are fables. So I'm going to try to make it read like it's history, but don't be under any illusion that it is accurate history. You see, Plutarch was saying that in those cases, he was not capable of writing good history, accurate history. He didn't have the sources. When it came to large-scale conjecturing, yes, something in the distant past, but within 140 years, he had plenty of stuff. The Gospels were written within 35 to 65 years of Jesus. There was no need for large-scale conjecturing. And as we saw with the authorship, they were using very good sources. So this leads us to a topic, memory, and this is something that had been recently raised by more skeptical scholars, how we can't trust memory. And they'll point out things to say that, we can't trust memory because even if it's within a pretty short period of time, our memories are fallible. And it is true our memories are fallible. I've messed up in my memory at times. I recall an event that happened shortly after I was married. My wife and I, we went to a conference. We checked into a hotel room. We were broke, and we were really struggling at the time, but we checked into this really nice hotel where the conference was. We unpacked, we went to dinner, and then to the conference afterward. And when we came back that night, as soon as we walked in the room, I knew someone had been in the room. Now, we were just hicks at the time. We'd never stayed in a real nice hotel. And why did we think someone had been in the room? Because the lights were on. The radio was playing. The sheets on our bed had been pulled down and mints put on our pillows just to disrespect us. I called the front desk. Front desk, yeah, this is Licona in 213. Someone's been in our room. How do you know? Well, because the lights were on, the radio's playing, our sheets have been pulled down, and just to let us know for sure that we didn't overlook it, they put mints on our pillows. I said, well, Mr. Licona, that's our turn-down service. We do that for all of our guests. Oh. And of course, they're just laughing at the front desk at our expense. Who could blame them? Now, my wife and I remember everything about that night. All the details, we are right on step with one another, except one detail. She says that the hotel was in Richmond, Virginia, and I said it's in Dallas, Texas. Now, one of us has it wrong. Probably her. But it shows our memory can be mistaken. But you know what? That doesn't undermine the event that we went to that conference. It's a peripheral detail that messed up there. Now, I know I'm talking to a bunch of students here, so some of you may not remember, but how many of you remember 9/11? Okay, a bunch of you. How many of you remember what the weather was like on 9/11? What was it? Do you remember?
It was sunny.
Sunny. It was that way all over the country. It doesn't matter where I lecture in the country, it was that way all over the country. We remember it was sunny that day. Well, let me ask you a question. Anybody remember what the weather was like on September 11th last year? Me either. Why? Because something as big as 9/11 and what happened. We remember what the weather was like. We remember where we were. It was important to us. It impacted us in a deep way. We remember it. September 11th last year, we don't remember, right? So when they give an example, critics like to give an example of the Challenger disaster back in 1986 when it blew up. I remember where I was when I learned that. I was really into the NASA stuff then. I wanted to be an astronaut when I grew up. And then I rode my first roller coaster and got motion sickness. It's not going to happen. So I remember that, but there was an interview. They interviewed some students shortly after that, and then 6 months later, and they said, you know, what happened and where were you? And a lot of the students, they contradicted one another 6 months after that initial interview. And they said, well, did you realize you contradicted yourself? No, but I'm right now. I must have been wrong then. So, you know, they can have this. But you know what? Probably hardly any of those students cared much at all about the Challenger. They're not into space flight and all this. But I can guarantee you that the spouses of all 7 of those astronauts knew exactly where they were at. They remember what the weather was like on that day. They remember their last words to their spouses because it impacted them personally. Now, when we come to memory, it's funny, I was in a doctor's office a few years ago, and as I'm coming out, there's this really old guy, probably in his late 80s, early 90s, and he's wearing a ball cap with a B-29 on it. And I thought, wow, he probably flew on one of those. And I walked out of the office. Well, my wife and I love everything World War II. And it just got the best of me. And I turned around and I walked back in the office and I walked right up to that guy and I said, excuse me, sir, did you fly a B-29 in World War II? He said, I sure did, son. I said, you must have some amazing stories. Yeah, we were in the Pacific Theater. And I'll never forget it. The native women on those islands, they had a horrible odor to them. And here he was remembering that 65 to 70 years later. It's amazing. People do have these kind of memories. We remember where we were with 9/11. How many of you saw the movie We Were Soldiers? Okay. That Colonel, Hal Moore, just died recently. Hal Moore was played by Mel Gibson. It's about the first conflict that the U.S. forces actually had engaging the North Vietnamese army in 4 days of intense battle in the Ia Valley in Vietnam in November 1965. It was just horrible battle for 4 days. And during that time, the Americans lost, I think, 251 of their guys, and the Special Forces guys, and another 245 were injured. It was just a terrible time. And if you watch the movie, you can see what these guys went through. Well, there was a combat reporter named Joe Galloway, and Galloway in the movie, he later on teamed up with Hal Moore, the Colonel, and wrote a book, Once We Were Soldiers, and that's the book upon which the movie We Were Soldiers is based. Well, a few years ago, my wife and I were watching Vietnam in HD, and in the very first episode, Joe Galloway appears a few times, and he gets all choked up at one point, just remembering what had happened decades before. And then there was this one point. It's a 1-minute clip, and I rewound it, played it again, and then I transcribed it, and I thought, you know what, I'm just going to capture that 1-minute video, and I did. And I want to play it for you because it's pretty profound, and you'll see how it fits into what we're talking about.
I left that landing zone X-ray.
Battlefield, knowing that young Americans had laid down their lives so that I might live. They had sacrificed themselves for me and their buddies. What I was learning was that there are some events that are so overwhelming that you can't simply be a witness. You can't be above it. You can't be neutral. You can't be untouched by it. Simple as that. You see it, you live it, you experience it, and it will be with you all of your days.
Jesus' deeds were memorable. If he actually did those things that are reported in the Gospels, yeah, the Gospels and their sources were capable of recalling what had happened if those things happened. But what about Jesus' teachings? What about those? Would they have been remembered? But I got thinking about this a few years ago. Jesus didn't have to come up with a new sermon for every town he went in, right? He's going a couple towns a day. Hold on a second, guys. Back up. I'm still working on this new message here. Pastors every Sunday, that's tough enough. Imagine for every town he's going in. No, he's not coming up with a new one. He's just like other itinerant speakers. He probably had a dozen sermons, maybe 20 sermons, who knows how many. But he has these sermons. And he's able to give the same sermons to these towns. And he's telling these same sermons over and 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 over. And then what does Jesus do after they hear him so many times? He does what any good teacher would do. And we know, you want to learn something, you teach it, right? And so he says, guys, you've heard it. A lot of you have taken notes. You know what I've said. Go up by twos now and go to these different towns and teach. And now they've got people there. Yep, they got notes. They can correct one another. And they go out now and they take the same teachings and they teach them. Over and 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 over. And then they come back. They debrief Jesus, and he could correct them if they got something wrong. And now, for the remainder of Jesus' ministry, they hear him again teach the same things over and 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 over. And then he's crucified, rises from the dead, commissions them to go out and preach the gospel to the world. And guess what? For the next 3 decades, thousands of times, they preach the same messages over and over and over. And you get the idea, right? It's not like it was with Patrick Henry's famous liberty or death speech that he gave once, that no notes have survived. And that this entire speech, famous speech in our history, has been reconstructed based on 2 eyewitnesses, most from one eyewitness who did not take notes and who is recalling the entire thing from memory 41 years later. Now, did Patrick Henry say everything in that speech? Don't know. I don't know how historically reliable it is. I don't even know if it's true enough. Probably he said that statement, give me liberty or give me death, because it was on the flag that was held by the band that was led by Patrick Henry. Probably said that, but beyond that, we don't know a whole lot more with confidence. But with Jesus, preaching the same thing so many times that his disciples had heard, and then they preached it continuously for decades. It is not at all like some skeptical scholars like to say that so-and-so passed it on to so-and-so, and she told her sister, who told her husband, who traveled over here, and he said, hey, guess what happened? My wife told me. It happened here, and it does this for 35 to 40 years, and what story is left after going like the game of telephone all those years, that is what Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote down. But that doesn't have to be anything like it actually happened. We can see that the gospel authors used good judgment in their choice of sources, and they were certain their sources, and they were capable of recording and recalling the past accurately. All right, so our 5 criteria, those were our 3. Here's the fourth one. When possible, we can verify the truth of numerous reported items. These last two go pretty quickly. Many items agree with the existing background knowledge. Many items in the Gospels. For example, names. Tal Ilan, a female Jewish scholar, first did a study on names, Jewish Palestinian names in late antiquity, and then later on Richard Bauckham did it. They came to similar conclusions, and what they found is that the names in the Gospels were common names of Palestinian Jews of that period, but not those of the diaspora Jews, those that were dispersed outside of Palestine due to persecution. They appear with roughly the same frequency in the Gospels as found in extra-biblical data, such as non-Christian Jewish and Roman sources, as well as epigraphical material that we found on tombs and on inscriptions and ossuaries, things like that. And this suggests that the authors were well acquainted with Palestine in that period. Doesn't prove what they're saying is true, but it does prove that if the authors of the Gospels were writing accurate history, they would have to be well acquainted with Palestine. The ancient authors show that they're well acquainted with Palestine in that period. The persons mentioned in the Gospels, Augustus, Caiaphas, all these, we know that many of these figures actually existed. Same thing with many of the places that are mentioned in the Gospels. Again, the authors are familiar with Jewish Palestine, and they're familiar with historical figures who had lived in that time, and they're writing within a relatively brief period of the events. They get many of the procedures are correct. So, for example, you'll find some scholars that say, well, you can't believe the burial accounts in the Gospels because we know the Romans had this custom of leaving crucified victims on their crosses and allowing birds and dogs and insects to feed off their corpses, and then they would just take the corpses off and throw them in a shallow grave. Well, that's true for most of the Roman Empire. But then you read Josephus, his Jewish Wars, Book 4, Section 317, and you see the Romans made an exception when it came to Jerusalem prior to the year 70, that they allowed the crucified to be removed and given a proper burial prior to sunset. So it's pretty interesting that we find in the Gospel of John that they wanted those corpses removed and given a proper burial prior to sunset, just like we find in the ancient literature. All this historical verisimilitude checks out when it comes to the Gospels, just what we would expect if the Gospels were telling us truth. And then we can confirm a number of items about Jesus. Let me give you some what we could call minimal facts. These are even historical bedrock. These are facts that are the data for which the data is so strong that the majority, the overwhelming majority, not just a slight majority, but a strong, nearly unanimous consensus of scholars today, including atheists, agnostics, and Jewish scholars, they agree. They agreed that Jesus was a Jewish itinerant preacher who went around Palestine preaching that God had chosen him to usher in his kingdom. That he performed deeds that astonished crowds and that many thought were miracles and exorcisms. That's not to say that these scholars say that they're miracles and exorcisms, but he was performing astonishing deeds that were so amazing that many interpreted them as miracles and exorcisms. That he taught in parables. That he taught that the kingdom of God was at hand. That he confronted the Jewish leaders. That at the instigation of those same Jewish leaders, Pilate had him crucified. And that shortly thereafter, his disciples reported that he was alive and had appeared to them. Virtually every scholar who studies the subject agrees on those things based on the historical data. Now, I think we could go a lot further than that based on the historical evidence, but what I've given you is something that even skeptical scholars, in fact, Bart Ehrman, who was here like a month or so ago, would grant, I think, every single one of those things that I just mentioned. Because the evidence is that good. Number 5, only a very small percent of reported items are known to be false. Well, when it comes to the Gospels, there's nothing in them that we know to be false. There are a few things, a very few things, that appear that they may be false. The one that first comes to mind is Luke's report that Caesar Augustus took a census throughout the Roman Empire during the time when, Quirinius was proconsul of Syria. And what we have in the historical record seems to suggest that Luke may have gotten that wrong. Now, the Roman records aren't exactly complete. So there might be some things here that would shed greater light on what Luke is saying. But that would be one thing, and probably the only thing of which I'm aware right now, where they could say one of the gospel authors got something wrong. That's the only thing that I look at and say that's that's a decent candidate for an error. Although we can never prove it's an error. We can say that's a decent candidate for one. Other than that, I can't think of anything in the Gospels that they would look at, a historian could look at and say, well, that's definitely false. We can disprove that historically because of other things we know. So, again, we're not asking if the Gospels are inerrant or divinely inspired. We're asking, are they historically reliable? And even if we were to say that Luke got that wrong, which I would not be willing to do, but even if we were willing to say he got that wrong, Luke could still be historically reliable based on the other things that we've seen. So those are our 5 items, our 5 criteria. And then I'll skip the third one because I'd like to open it up. That's concerns. Now let me just say something real quick. Theological statements. Of course, we can never verify theological statements. So for example, as a historian, we can show that Jesus died by crucifixion. But a historian cannot show that Jesus' death atones for my sin. And a historian, we don't have the tools for that, right? I mean, you can't put your laptop in an MRI and ask it to diagnose why it's running slowly. You've got to use the right tools, and there's just no way that a historian could verify that Jesus' death atones for sins, or that God is a Trinity, or Jesus is right now seated at God's right hand. That's not to say that those things aren't true. It's just to say a historian, as a historian, cannot verify those. That's okay. There's stuff like that in all ancient literature that has opinions and things like this. It doesn't have to be religious statements. It could be other stuff that just simply can't be verified. There are certain things in the Gospels for which we don't have corroboration. Like, for example, I think we've got really good evidence that Jesus died by crucifixion. We got really good evidence, I think, that he rose from the dead. We don't have really good historical evidence that he was born of a virgin. Now, I believe he was born of a virgin, but I can't prove it historically. But you know what? There are a lot of things in Plutarch and Tacitus that can't be proven either. It doesn't mean they're not historically reliable. Perhaps the biggest objection to the historical reliability of the Gospels is that it contains supernatural events. And if you're an atheist, you can see where that would be a challenge to your worldview. You know? And so an atheist wouldn't be inclined to believe those kinds of things. But it's important to recognize that that's based on a worldview judgment, not on evidence. And for me, I look and say, you know, there's some pretty good evidence for a supernatural dimension in reality. Things like well-evidenced near-death experiences, veridical apparitions, extreme answered prayer, paranormal phenomena. I could give you some amazing examples for each of these documented examples. I think the evidence for a supernatural dimension is so strong that it'd be hard for someone to look at the evidence, deny it, and still think of themselves as a realist. And if there's a supernatural dimension, well then what's so big about a resurrection, or so difficult to believe about a resurrection? And if Jesus rose from the dead, a virgin birth is child's play, huh? So anyway, those are some of the things. So that's it.
Hi. Do you know anything about how old, say, the oldest fragmentary or nearly complete manuscripts we have of the canonical Gospels are? Or when in the historical record do most of them start showing up?
Okay, so am I on now? Okay. The oldest manuscript, known manuscript we have is a fragment from the Gospel of John. It's P52, papyrus number 52, and it's been dated somewhere between the years 96 and 150. We can't get any more precise than that. So, I mean, you could take a middle date of 125. So that's our oldest known one. There are a few that are being examined right now. One of them may be, it's a fragment of the Gospel of Mark, may be as old as that. We've got some, I just looked at it recently, of Paul's letters, and we've got some really early manuscripts of those that contain, the entirety of some of those letters, and pretty cool stuff. In terms of the earliest manuscript we have of the Gospels in their entirety, I'm not sure. That's not a field that I've spent a lot of time in with the textual criticism in manuscripts.
Thank you.
It just came to my mind. In studying Plutarch, we do have a few fragments that are within maybe 100 to 200 years, but other than that, almost all of the manuscripts of Plutarch's lives come from the 10th centuries and later. So we're talking 800 to usually the 10th to the 15th century. So 800 to 1400 years after Plutarch actually, 800 to 1300 years after Plutarch actually wrote, is where almost all of our manuscripts for Plutarch's lives are. When you come to the New Testament, even Bart Ehrman will say that it is the best attested literature, the New Testament, the best attested literature, manuscript-wise, in the ancient world.
If the oldest fragment of the Gospels is from 125 AD, then how do we know that they were written before that?
Okay, that's a good question. So I'm going to do it. I have to turn this off every time. Okay. So, you have people like Clement of Rome, who was probably a disciple of the Apostle Peter, and he wrote around the year 90 to 95. It's possible he even wrote in the late 60s. So people think either late 60s or the mid to late or early to mid 90s. And you'll have people like him and Ignatius, an early church father, who wrote probably around the year 110, maybe a little earlier, maybe a little later, but generally around 110 on his way to execution in Rome. He wrote several letters. You got a guy named Polycarp. And remember some of these names, because if you ever have a child someday, he's a boy, Polycarp, Ignatius, and he's writing around the year 125. And so a lot of these ancient authors, like I mentioned, they quote from gospel material. You have people so they'll quote from it. And so that would go back earlier because they're mentioning it. Now maybe you say, well, how do we know that they wrote then? When's the earliest manuscripts from them? Well, the earliest manuscripts would be older, but any challenge that it would be for that would apply to others as well. So how would you know Tacitus wrote and Suetonius wrote in the early 2nd century, like 110 to 115? Well, there's reasons for that. So, well, what's their earliest manuscripts? Well, they're a lot later than what you have for the Gospels. Like Tacitus, I think the earliest manuscript is 11th century. But there's still good reason to believe that they would be they'd still be earlier. Unless you want to believe that those are the original manuscripts, which we'd love to have the original manuscripts. But even so, if John wrote around 125, which I don't think anyone believes that today, that's still less than 100 years after Jesus was crucified. That's pretty good.
Mark Ehrman and you are basing a lot of things on the same facts. You have a lot of the same facts. Why are his conclusions so different, and why are they regarded by so many as sound?
That's a good question. Well, a lot of scholars do not regard them, what Ehrman says, as sound. And a lot of times Ehrman will say this is what scholars believe, And like he'll say, we have no idea who wrote the Gospels. Well, Ehrman may not have any idea who wrote the Gospels, but New Testament scholars have a pretty good idea who wrote, several of them. So he will say certain things, and he'll say scholars believe these things, but not necessarily. It's not really true, a lot of the things that he says. Like, one time he said he was in some conference and some discussion going on, and I think it was Ben Witherington who said, well, 2 Thessalonians, and Ehrman said, well, Paul didn't write Thessalonians. 2 Thessalonians, the majority of scholars would say he didn't. And Ben said, no, I've written a commentary on it. I know what the scholars are saying. And the majority of scholars do think that Paul wrote 2 Thessalonians. I don't know what to tell you other than it would be up to you to look at the data yourself and to make an assessment. You're correct that Ehrman and I do look at the same material, the same data, and we arrive at different conclusions. So I would encourage you to go to that written debate on this topic, risenjesus.com/Gospels, and read what Ehrman's arguments for not holding to the historical reliability of the Gospels. Everything he presents in there is what he typically presents. And then you can read my positive case for the historical reliability of the Gospels, and then you can see how we interact with each other and respond to one another's arguments. And then you can choose for yourself who you think is presenting the better arguments. That's about all I could say. So I like Bart, but I think he's really wrong on a lot of things. And I think it's easy to point these out. And I think I pointed out where he's wrong in a lot of these things quite clearly. But it'd be up to you whether you think I'm right.
It's not common, but there are some places like, for example, the story of the fig tree, between different Gospels where one author said it shriveled immediately and the other author said they came back the next day and noticed it was shriveled. Does that have any bearing on the Gospel's historical reliability?
Yeah, good question. No, I don't think it does, and here's why. And I discussed that particular pericope or story in my book, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? I think it's pretty obvious that Matthew is employing a compositional device we could call compression, where he compresses the events to have occurred over a shorter period of time than they actually occurred. This is something that other ancient biographers do as well. So Matthew, or I should say, the other Gospels say that Jesus cursed the tree, like Mark, he cursed the tree, and then he went into Jerusalem, and then he came out, went back to Bethany, spent the night there, and then he went to Jerusalem the next day, and they noticed the tree at that point had withered and died. Whereas Matthew just happened to go on into Jerusalem. There's no figs on the tree, Jesus curses it, and immediately it withers and dies. So he's just cutting to the chase. He's saying, look, I don't need to give all of these details here. It doesn't matter that they went into Jerusalem and then they spent the night in Bethany and then the next day. He's given the guy version of the story. He cursed it, it withered and died, period. It's true enough. And we can be glad that Matthew did that. Why? He doesn't mess around with, and by the way, Matthew, that's his tendency, to compress stories. He doesn't deal with a lot of the details, he compresses stories. And I'm glad he did it, because he includes more stories in his gospel as a result. And I'd rather know more stories of what happened, stories that Mark didn't include. But that's also why I'm glad that there are 4 Gospels. So I get the 4 different accounts, I can look at that, and I can say, hey, look, Matthew compressed that, and I can recognize that's exactly what Matthew's doing there. It becomes easy when you see patterns that this is what they do, especially when we know Matthew's using Mark as his primary source.
So you said that we could look up and sort of fact check. and that's one thing I like to do. But one thing I don't know how to do is find the best or very reliable sources for commentaries by experts on these sorts of topics. And obviously, a Google search is not going to cut it.
Yeah, fair question. Well, you know, publishing on the World Wide Web does not make you a world-class scholar. So you're wise and being discriminate and using good judgment in your choice of sources. I commend you for that. So, yeah, not all commentaries are good. Some are useless. Some didn't need to be written. And there's some good ones, and you don't have to agree with everything the person says. I mean, I read commentaries written by scholars on all the different viewpoints, you know, because I want to know what they're saying. Some of them you can tell that they're really good scholars, and others, you know, I don't even know why they're writing this, you know. A couple good commentaries I like the Anchor Bible Commentaries series. These academic commentaries are expensive. Like, if you want the New Testament in that, it's going to run you about $1,000. The International Critical Commentary series, New Testament alone, is about $1,100. That's a really good commentary series. I like the New International Greek Text Commentary series. That'll run you about $700. The New International Commentary on the New Testament, that's about $700-800. That's a good one. Word Biblical Commentary, that's a decent, really good one. I mean, I can name some others. Pillar is pretty good. Pillar is pretty conservative. Anchor is not. So I mean, so you can get all these different viewpoints, and you have moderate, conservative, liberal scholarship, and all of this. So I like to read all of those and get those. Those are some of the better, I think, commentary series.
Is there any way, as a college student who does not have that kind of money, to see
Yeah.
commentaries to find accurate?
You know, I'm fortunate as a professor. I don't have that kind of money either, but I'm fortunate that Logos Bible Software has kind of liked me, and they said, hey, if you're willing to write an endorsement and do this for us, we'll give you some stuff. And so I've done some work for them and work for commentaries, you know. So let's see. I don't know what your theological commentary, our library is like here.
We have an Anchor Bible commentary.
You have Anchor Bible commentary? Okay, that's good. So you can always borrow them interlibrary loan. I don't know what to tell you. I mean, it's just if your school doesn't have it here, and you don't have them on Logos or something to purchase these, it can be kind of tough. But those are the really good sources, you know, to check for commentaries, I think. There are some others. And sometimes I like the New American Commentary series, the NAC. That's really conservative, and it does have some good stuff in it. But sometimes these guys just take the party line, and I don't like that. I mean, if they defend it, that's fine. But sometimes you can just see these commentators, they just take whatever the party line is. And I feel like I'm just getting something that's been freeze-dried, pre-packaged, denominationally stamped of approval, and put on the shelf for my consumption. You will eat this. And that's not what I want. I want good scholarly work that, you know, they're out there to get truth, not something just to verify any cherished beliefs that they have.
So in the spirit of what he was asking, I want to pose to you what I think Dr. Ehrman might challenge you with based on his last visit. He proposed that the triumphal entry event was an event that is most likely distorted, or it's been purposefully manipulated, or is a false memory, because in that event Jesus came into the city triumphantly, was announced to be king by many of the people there. And we know that Pontius Pilate would have been in the area right around the Passover. And based on his character account and other historical records, would likely have put down such an event and arrested Jesus on the spot. he concludes from that Jesus most likely did not enter triumphantly, or something about the accounts altered. So what would you say to him if he was to challenge you in that regard?
Okay, well,
And I wish you were here.
maybe you'll have to bring him back and me back, and we can do some kind of a debate or discussion. That'd be fun, don't you think, Barry?
Great.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. So I guess I would respond to that and say that, well, of course, we cannot get into a time machine and go back and verify things. So we can look at the possibility and say, well, it's not exactly how it happened. It's possible it didn't happen exactly in that way. But if Ehrman were to say, well, we can't even trust that the triumphal entry happened at all, I think that'd be going a little too far. Because these things are painting portraits of Jesus, and it's like John Dominic Crossan and some others, they present this peaceful Jesus who is a politically correct Jesus who doesn't want to offend anyone. So the story of Jesus confronting the Pharisees and the scribes and all these, that wouldn't have happened because Jesus wasn't that way. Or Jesus wouldn't have cursed the fig tree because he was an environmentalist. Or, something like that. Well, if Jesus was this guy that was so tame, then why would Pilate have crucified him? What would have led to Pilate crucifying him? And I might say to Ehrman, well, wait a minute. When Pilate was brutal to people, Jews in the past, there was this building crescendo of events. And it wasn't just they did something and boom. It was usually a bunch of events that got Pilate just really angry with him, and then you just said enough and acted. Well, this was a lone event of Jesus. There were the temple police. They could have arrested Jesus, And remember, Jesus does this on Palm Sunday. The Romans crucified him less than a week later. So why would we have to say that the Romans would have arrested Jesus on the spot? First of all, the Romans would not have been in the temple. They weren't allowed in the temple. So they would not have arrested him on the spot. Maybe the Jewish police would have, but they didn't. And maybe it's because just like Jesus, the Gospels report, he did it and then he left. He comes back the next day and they say, well, who gave you the authority to do this? And Jesus gives them a quid pro quo, right? Well, I'll tell you what, you answer my question, I'll answer yours. So you have all this playing and jockeying for position going on, and finally they get him on Thursday, and he's crucified by the Romans on Friday, and probably, could very well be that when they brought him before Pilate, they mentioned the temple thing. We don't expect that everything the Gospels report is an exhaustive account. It couldn't have been an exhaustive account. So they might have mentioned it to Pilate on Friday, and that was part of Pilate's reasons for crucifying him. So I don't see any reason to think that the Romans would have had to have arrested him on the spot. It's reported in Mark and it's reported in John, so you have multiple independent sources, even though John has probably displaced it and placed it in a different chronology. But it seems like you have multiple independent sources there, so it appears to have been an event that was remembered to have occurred in the life of Jesus. I don't see any reason for rejecting it.
Also, we learned about a month ago that the reason we don't have historical accuracy is that we have a copy of a copy of the copy of the copy and over and of the copy. So can you address that? And also he's a textual critic, Barter, and he said that there's just so many errors that I don't think we really have the New Testament.
He does say that, doesn't he?
Yeah, he said it a month ago.
But you know what he also says in the books that he writes? He says this does not lead us to the conclusion that we don't know what they said. And he says and I know this is fresh on my mind because the end of February, I debated an atheist philosopher named Larry Shapiro at Ohio State University. And he brings this up in his book. He quotes Ehrman, and he says, see, we just got copies of copies of copies of copies. And that, he says, no. Now, he's almost attributing this next part to Ehrman, but Ehrman doesn't say this. He says it gets to the point where where almost all scholars say we can't know what was written, and that the Gospels we have today aren't even a reflection of what the original said. And then he quotes Ehrman on this. And I said, well, have you read also what Ehrman says about this? He says there's not a textual critic on the planet who thinks that we can't get back to what they said. And in fact, in his book with Bruce Metzger, The Text of the New Testament, Bruce Metzger, probably the greatest New Testament text critic of our day, although he died just a few years ago. Ehrman, in that book, in the appendix, they ask him, well, does it mean you don't trust the New Testament? No. Metzger and I agree on just about everything here. You know, there are a few instances, but no, what we have today is pretty much what was originally written. So this thing about the copies of the copies of the copies of the copies is just show. It's just sensationalism to introduce doubts. But if you were to ask Ehrman then and say, so Bart, are you saying that the New Testament literature that we have today is not an accurate reflection of what was originally written? He would, if he's going to be consistent with what he's written, he would say, oh no, that's not at all what I'm saying. But it sure leads people to think that, doesn't it? And Ehrman's one of the leading textual critics of our day, one of the finest out there. So yeah, there are a lot of errors committed by scribes in our manuscripts, but we know where most of those are. And as Dan Wallace, another one of the preeminent textual critics, he talks about, is the difference, is it viable, meaning based on the manuscript evidence? Is the alternate reading that we have, is it viable? And is it meaningful? So, for example, in 1 John 1:4, I think it is, he says, we write these things in order that our joy may be complete. But there's an alternate reading that says we have written these things so that your joy may be complete. Well, which is it? There's only one letter difference in the Greek. Which is it? Well, the manuscript evidence for both is pretty good. So it is a viable alternate reading. Is it meaningful? Yes, it's meaningful. Because it changes ours to yours. The number of differences or places in our Gospels that are both viable and meaningful. In other words, we don't know what the original said because the alternatives are pretty good. And the alternative reading does make a difference in the meaning, even if it's ours to yours, is 1/4 of 1%. And none of them impact any gospel doctrine. So there's a whole lot of smoke out there, but not a lot of fire. It's a lot to do over not much at all. And if Ehrman doesn't like the New Testament Gospels in that way, then I'd say let's talk Plutarch, let's talk Suetonius and Tacitus, and Cicero and Sallust and Cassius Dio and all these others. Because as I point out in that written debate, everything that you say, if we apply it to the Gospels, you've also got to apply it to all ancient literature. So by saying the Gospels are not historically reliable, you'd have to say that we have no ancient literature that is historically reliable.
Thank you for your talk. I have two questions, but you can pick one that you think is more interesting. So you said that there are ancient biographies that are fictional, and I don't know if they were intended to be fictional or if they just didn't have the capacity to write something that's accurate. Now, but if the first case is true, then kind of the whole argument with the historicity of the New Testament kind of goes out the door. If they intended for it to be fictional, and so a lot of people would say that while the New Testament might satisfy the criteria that we would use for typical history, just the fact that the claims that it's making is extraordinary, that it would require more evidence than that. And so they would kind of combine these two and make an argument. And so the first question is how you might respond.
Let me answer that one first.
Sure. Okay.
So in answer to that, I would say, yeah, because it's ancient biography, that doesn't mean that it's all historical. I did say that. But they do state their intent to write accurate history. And almost all the ancient biographies involve real characters. So they do play with them a little bit, like, for example, Philostratus's Life of Apollonius of Tyana. Tyana was a historical person. We know that he was a traveling itinerant speaker, a philosopher. We know some of his teachings. But we also know that Philostratus wasn't necessarily discriminate in his use of sources. We know that he was writing for the wife of the emperor at that point, and she wanted something that would compete with Christianity. And so a lot of the stuff is there. You know, you have these post-death appearances of Apollonius, but there's only one. And see, Apollonius did not believe in like a bodily resurrection. It was more Hellenized thought, getting the soul, the spirit outside and released from the prison of the body. So he doesn't actually appear in person, even as a ghost or something, an apparition to his followers. The only account that we have in Philostratus of a post-death appearance, and Philostratus says there's competing accounts on whether he even died. And he says his major source is Damus of Nineveh. Well, Nineveh had been destroyed a few hundred years before Christ. So what does that say about Damus? It's like saying, what do you do with the Wizard of Oz when you discover there's no Oz? And that's his primary source, he says. But he says this appearance of Apollonius happened to a disciple of Apollonius. But he doesn't say if this was a disciple 100 years later, or if it happened a week later or a month later. And he appeared to this guy in a dream, and others were around, and nobody else saw it. So, I mean, maybe it was just a dream. That's the only resurrection appearance that's made. But, I mean, there's reason to be suspect of some of what Philostratus says there about Apollonius. But that doesn't mean Apollonius was not a historical figure. It's just there's a commingling of some legend, of some myth in there that goes with the history. But Apollonius was still a historical figure, and a number of the things, like some of Apollonius' teachings in that biography, are probably historical. The problem is we don't have much on Apollonius, so there's not a lot that we can verify historically. But again, I'm not saying that because they're ancient biographies, that even if they state historical intent, that means that everything's true in it. But those are things, just like we looked at in the fourth and fifth criteria, you want them there if they're going to be historically reliable. And then there are other things that you can verify, like in, I think, the fourth criteria, and then the third criteria, you know, are the sources capable of recalling the past? The second criterion, you know, did they use good judgment in their choice of sources? These are the kinds of things we look for, right? So the fact that they're biographies, the first criterion, doesn't mean everything, but you build a cumulative case. You want that. You don't want it to be novel, right? You want it to be biography or history if it's going to report things with historical reliability. All right, your second question.
You're treating these texts as historical records, but in these texts there were sections of it obviously cannot be, for instance, where the private conversations were recorded, where nobody would be there to hear. And so people would say that those were inspired. So if that's the case, then that text is not purely historical, and how would you distinguish?
Okay, fair question. I'm guessing you're thinking of something along the lines of Jesus' conversation with Pilate, right? Well, how do we know that no one else was there? How do we know that Pilate didn't have an attendant there, or that one of his soldiers was likewise present? Just because they don't mention the person doesn't mean that no one else was there. There's a compositional device that we can call literary spotlighting. It's probably the most common compositional device that I noticed in Plutarch. And so, for example, I mean, I can give you several, but in the Catilinarian conspiracy of November 63 BC, you have the senator Sergius Catilina, who I mentioned about Sallust reporting when he gave a final speech to his army before they were destroyed. So Crassus, the famous Roman general who defeated Spartacus, gets these letters handed to him one night in November, and they're addressed to Cicero and all the senators, and they're there to reveal the conspiracy that Catiline is involved in. And so, according to Plutarch's life of Cicero, Crassus and two others who are named, I think it's Marcellus and Metellus, they go to Cicero's house at night and they wake up Cicero and they hand him the letters that exposes Catiline's conspiracy. And the next day, Cicero calls the Senate and see what to do. Well, in Plutarch's life of Crassus, he only mentions Crassus bringing the letter to Cicero at night. Why? He's shining his spotlight on Crassus because that's his main character. And although Plutarch knows other people are present, he doesn't mention them because they're not that important. Again, this is very common in the ancient literature. And so just because it says they brought Jesus before Pilate and they don't mention anyone else, well, Pilate and Jesus are the two people who are interacting. It doesn't mean that nobody else was there. So that would be one answer I'd give, one possibility. Another possibility I'd give is that, let's see, it would be John's Gospel that mentions that conversation going on. And it would have been appropriate for an ancient historian to engage in conjecturing what that conversation was like. And so maybe they'd say, let's just say John crafted that conversation, but John wasn't aware of what was actually said. He would do it with a verisimilitude of what it was probably like, just like Sallust created that speech that Catiline gave to his army before going into battle against the Romans. That they would have constructed that conversation between Jesus and Pilate behind closed doors of what it was probably like. Now, I don't think that that's what happened. It would have been appropriate and completely within the limits of writing ancient biography to do such a thing. I don't think that that's what happened, and here's why. And here's what we might look at as something that's been around for over 100 years, called an undesigned coincidence. So you've got Luke reporting that Jesus was brought before Pilate. To me, this is the most impressive undesigned coincidence in the Gospels. Luke reports that Jesus was brought before Pilate, and Pilate says, "Are you a king?" And Jesus said, "You've said." In other words, yep. And Luke, the very next statement says, Pilate came out and said, "I find no fault with this man." What? This guy's just claims, you've asked him, "Are you a king?" And he said, "Yes." And you said you find no fault in him? What's going on here? Well, that makes no sense if you just read it in Luke's Gospel. But if you read it in light of this conversation between Pilate and Jesus in John's Gospel, it makes sense. It's just that Luke isn't reporting this conversation. A conversation which was probably known by Christians and the readers of the Gospels at that point. Luke just doesn't mention it. John does. It's an undesigned coincidence. So there's a number of things that could be going on here that would explain these conversations. I don't think you'd look at them. I mean, again, it's possible that they were crafted for verisimilitude purposes. Something, again, that was entirely allowable within the limits of writing ancient history and biography. Even Thucydides said that when you're reconstructing a speech, and Thucydides is one of the most highly revered historians in all of antiquity. And he said when you're reconstructing a speech, you want to, hopefully you were an eyewitness. If you weren't, you want to get the testimony of eyewitnesses. And if you don't have any, then you reconstruct the speech according to what that person would have said on that occasion. So, I mean, again, John would have been entirely within his rights as a biographer, a historian, to create a speech, a dialogue between Jesus and Pilate. But when you read Luke, I don't think that's what happened. Seems like John does preserve it. It's probably because someone else was there and was able to relay that.
You mentioned that, I don't remember exactly what you said, but you said something about Josephus and his writing style and how maybe some of the things he was saying weren't entirely reliable. But then you also mentioned that what you called on Josephus' testimony about the practice in Jerusalem of burying the corpses from the crosses by Sunday. Do you want to elaborate on why you use Josephus' testimony?
Sure. Well, first, Josephus isn't entirely reliable. On occasion, he boasts about himself, and it's self-serving. We know that he exaggerates numbers, like he talks about an insurrection against the Romans that involved, I think, like 50,000 people. Whereas Luke, in the book of Acts, remember the Tribune, I think it was the Tribune said to Paul, "Are you that Egyptian that out in the wilderness or whatever, that took 4,000 with him?" Well, Josephus says it was 50,000. And he talks about, I think it was like 3 or 4 million would come into Jerusalem during Passover. It just seems unthinkable that it would be that many people, like the city could accommodate that many people. And ancient historians were known to exaggerate. I mean, Plutarch exaggerates numbers. So these things just happen, and it was allowable, okay? You can compare how Josephus uses his sources. Like you can compare how Josephus tells the same story in his autobiography versus another thing that he writes. Or remember, he says he's going to quote the scriptures and not change things or add or subtract, and then you see him doing these things. But Josephus also gets things right, and does so often. Like, for example, when they uncovered Herod's bedroom, there were still chips of paint on the wall, and they were the same colors that Josephus reported they were. So he could get things accurate all the way down to the color of paint in Herod's bedroom. But he does report this thing about, it was like just a couple of years, probably the year 67 or 68, where some mercenaries of the Romans came into Jerusalem and they killed a bunch of Jews. And it says that the Jews were really upset about this because those mercenaries did not allow the bodies of the dead to be buried. And Josephus says because it was the custom of the Jews to remove the crucified and give them a proper burial prior to sunset up to that point. That's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
And that's right there with what the Gospels say. And you can't say that, Josephus wasn't a Christian, so he's not trying to add these little things to make the Gospels historically reliable to 21st century scholars. He's writing these things, and there's a lot of things that just line up in historically what happens. Pretty cool stuff.
All right, make a last call for questions.
I have a good one, actually. You mentioned evidence of the resurrection outside of the canonical Gospels, and also I think you mentioned Paul being a witness to the resurrection. Was Saul present at the resurrection?
What I mean by that is that he was an eyewitness of the risen Jesus. No, he never claims to have seen the resurrection.
Okay.
But people like Paul, I like to relate it like, sometimes I'll say it in my lectures on the resurrection, it's like historians are dealing with a hand of cards. And we always wish we had more cards. We wish the cards in our hand were better, but we got to play with the hand we've been dealt. So what kind of hand have we been dealt when it comes to the resurrection? And the Gospels, you can put some of them as like maybe Mark and Luke are queens, and John is a queen. Now, if John was the disciple, as I think he was, then he's a king. All right, but I'm just saying, I'm trying to minimize my bias, and if people say, if the majority of scholars are saying, well, he was either one of Jesus' disciples or he used one of Jesus' disciples as primary sources, well, that's a queen, okay? Well, if he was one of Jesus' minor disciples, he's a king. But if he was using it, so I'm just backing off and saying, okay, we'll just say he's a queen, like that. But Paul is our ace. Because he was a non-believer. He wasn't a disciple, he was a non-believer at the time of his experience in which he believed he saw the risen Jesus. He was not only a non-believer, he was out persecuting the church. So Jesus would have been the last person in the world Paul would have wanted to see or expected to see. Also, with Paul, we can establish that he knew the Jerusalem apostles. So one of Paul's undisputed letters is Galatians. And he says that 3 years after his conversion, he went up and spent 15 days with Peter, the lead apostle. And then it says 3 years later, he also saw James at that time, the brother of Jesus. And then 14 years later, he saw Peter, James, and John and ran the gospel message he'd been preaching past them to ensure he was preaching the same message they were preaching. And they verified he's preaching the same thing. Now that's Paul's report. So then I look at what Clement of Rome and Polycarp, who were disciples of Peter and John. What do they say about Paul? Do they speak of him in laudatory terms, neutral terms, negative terms? Because if they spoke of him in negative or neutral terms, well, maybe he was just making this up. But you got Clement of Rome calling him the blessed Paul. It puts him on par with his mentor Peter. While Polycarp says that Paul accurately and reliably taught the message of truth. Then he quotes from Paul's letters and refers to them as part of the sacred scriptures. Now, these aren't the kinds of things you say about Paul if he was teaching differently than your mentors Peter and John. But it's precisely the kind of things that you'd say if Paul was telling the truth, that he was preaching the same thing they were preaching. So here we got Paul. He was an enemy at the time of his conversion. He's an eyewitness. He claims to be an eyewitness to the risen Jesus. He knows the Jerusalem apostles, those who had actually walked with Jesus. And we can certify that he's preaching the same message they're preaching. Now that's historical gold. And regardless of any reservations someone might have about who wrote the Gospels, we can get back to the core preaching of Jesus' apostles, his disciples who had walked with him, through Paul. And it's something that even skeptical scholars acknowledge. He's our ace. And that's why I use Paul for the resurrection.
Thanks.
Great. Well, help me to thank Dr. Licona for really great stuff. I encourage you to visit his website. Also, please come out to our Monday night meetings. We meet at 7:15, again in Hardin, 233. Also, don't forget, we have a sign-up here at the exit. So if you want to learn more about us, to see our weekly meetings, topics, see if some of those interest you, sign up there. All right. Dr. Licona will be here for just a few minutes. You're going to come up and talk to him. I'm sure he'd love to meet you. Hope you have a good night. Drive safe.